Hi everybody, and big welcome to a deck tech video, or a form of update deck tech video of Animar. With us today we have JMCraig. Welcome!
Hey, thanks for having me here.
So I recently made a video, or actually first of all, I've actually made a deck tech video with an Animar enthusiast. And then a few years later, I make a review about Animar and like say that he is bad. He struggles, there are problems with Animar. And of course, we have people of different opinions, and that's great because we shouldn't be all my opinions all the time. So Craig disagrees, I think, or have some input to what I've said about Animar.
So in watching the video, what I found, and I think what a lot of people who play Animar today, whom I chat with over Discord, found was that the questions that you raised about Animar's viability, about the problems that the deck faces, those are all still very real problems for the deck. And this is something that the community and I have been working on over the past 6 months to a year to try and address, because we were having those very same problems as we tried to play the deck into increasingly powerful modern pods, modern metagames. And so what we've done in the time since then is we've really ironed out a lot of the issues that the deck had that was holding it back, and we've put together a much more modern deck than I think a lot of people are familiar with these days. So it's a great opportunity to kind of introduce the modern version of Animar to the community.
And this is basically that version, that's what we're seeing here. So you still have the same combo, I'm just guessing. If we scroll down here, you have a
You'll
Walking
definitely
Ballista.
find Ancestral Statue in this list, yeah.
Yeah, no brainer. And Walking Ballista and Sabertooth and Phyrexian Metamorph. So you're still going for the same combo. Like, what have mostly changed? I see a lot of typical Animar staples so far.
Something we found over the course of the last couple months was that while the game plan had traditionally been to play Animar turn 2 or as soon as possible, and then follow up with a bunch of 1 to 2 mana creatures to power up the counters on Animar, that game plan was actually pretty risky these days, because that usually involves doing something like play Tropical Island into a Llanowar Elf, follow it up with a Gold Land, and then play Animar, which basically leaves you tapped out for the first 1 to 3 turns, all to develop effectively one big body that you can kill with any kind of removal you want, almost. What we found was that the deck needed to be a lot more flexible in the early game if it was going to survive. And so we took out actually a lot of the cards that only really work if you have Animar in play. Things like Bond Beetle, things like even Painter's Servant, which don't really contribute to the game plan except very narrowly when we have Animar out and when we're trying to grind counters on him. And so what that does is that it opens up the early game a lot, so we have interaction for very, very fast decks like Inala, Rogsai, Cody, Dargo, that would previously have just completely blown us out in the first turn while we're going land, door, pass, you know? That game plan just doesn't work anymore. So the current aim is to do something like play a double mana source on turn 1, like a Soul Land, a Soul Ring, Tinderwall, follow that up with a Talisman, follow that up with other forms of colorless ramp, and that leaves mana open for the next couple turns, while also allowing us to develop mana, develop draw engines, develop other forms of value on board. So we basically changed the first couple turns into more of a traditional proactive mid-range game plan and less of an all-in Animar game plan.
And how do you develop afterwards, so to say? So you start putting some ramp and you start developing some form of mid-range position, and then what?
The easiest way to do this, most decks you'll see these days, is a bunch of ramp into something like a wheel. And Animar can't play wheels terribly well because decks in black that have access to Mnemonic Betrayal, Yogg's Will, Breach lines, they will eat that for breakfast. If you feed one of those decks a couple early wheels, they're going to have a Mnemonic Betrayal, and they're just going to make us look silly for having given them all that gas. So what we do instead is fall back on some of the traditional big Animar creatures that accumulate value in a much more one-sided way. The real hallmark of all of this, and it always has been, is Consecrated Sphinx. If we can power out a very early Consecrated Sphinx, we're in control of that game. That's our game to lose at that point. And people will fight over it, but if it sticks, we're golden. Things like Toski or in Frostfang fill a very similar role for us as these kind of early ramp payoffs. And I think the most interesting one is brand new, and that's Metzio Mugger. And the cool thing about that card is you can use it sort of like a Muldrifter early on by casting it as a temporary source, or you pay full price for it, and then you just have it there beating face and generating 4 draws per turn, effectively 4 impulse draws. It's also one of the only cards in the meta that lets you play other people's lands, so you're effectively not missing land drops once it comes down very early on. You're hitting things that our colors don't usually get to do. It's all the cool things you can do with Ragavan, but bigger and, times 4 every turn. So it's a surprisingly decent payoff. It also feeds into our Neoform, Eldritch Evolution, and Pod lines, in that it is exactly 1 CMC off Consecrated Sphinx. So we can do things like power that out and then immediately turn it into a Sphinx, get the death trigger, and we're golden. So instead of a traditional sort of mana into payoff plan, we play a more Animar-centric mana into payoff plan, in that we're using big creatures instead of wheels. I find Kyriana in a lot of the earlier Animar builds, probably around 2018 to 2020, and what we found since the inclusion of that was that Kyria on her own is sort of a mediocre card to draw into and to try to extract value from outside of the combo turn. And so what we ended up going with was Baron Master Wizard in her place. And you can do the same kind of one card Imperial Recruiter win con, because Baron himself is able to be found by Recruiter and also picks up and recasts Recruiter if we want to. The upside is that Baron is actually a fairly decent sort of mid-range grindy value piece on his own. He can do things like clear out an opposition agent or a Dranith Magistrate, so you don't feel as bad drawing into Baron as you would Kiri when you're not ready to combo.
So the basic takeaway, the big change, is that all the cards that is very commander-centric are basically gone to make the deck more function better without the commander in general, which is in general the best take you can do with every cEDH deck in general. cEDH decks that are very commander-centric usually suffers, so yeah.
The deck is probably 50-50 or more Dockside wins these days, because your goal is to power out an early Dockside, clone it, bounce it, and in the course of doing so and turning that into a big value engine, you start to assemble your Dockside combo almost incidentally, because you're getting a lot of draw, the deck plays a lot of creature tutors, so you're already pretty close to that Imperial Recruiter into Baron into a win. And so what we find is that a lot of the time, if you can establish an early Dockside for value, the deck sort of hands you a game plan from that point on, and that game plan may not necessarily involve Animar, it may not necessarily involve Ancestral Statue. So where previously we were looking to establish Animar on board very early, get 2 to 3 counters, and then find a double tutor or find a Statue and Ballista independently of one another, now you just want to power out a Dockside and let the deck do its thing. It'll have a lot of mana, it'll have a lot of tutors, and you'll be able to put together a Dockside win that way. So Weird Harvest, you'll notice, is actually the namesake of one of the 2 database Animar lists, so we consider it a pretty core part of the deck. And yet it's a very strange old card, and at first reading, it seems like it's pretty darn risky to play it, because you're effectively giving away the win if you can't get there this turn. So the classic word of warning is never, ever, ever Weird Harvest and pass. You will lose that game immediately. And if you get silenced after your Weird Harvest, you're done too, so you better have some backup for that. But if we can go for a Weird Harvest into either a Baron and a Dockside combo or a Statue and Ballista combo, there's actually not a ton that can stop us at instant speed on our turn to win right there. Something like a Hushbringer can do it, but generally speaking, I think you'll probably know the kinds of decks that want to be playing Hushbringer, and so you'll know whether or not you should be prepared for that. Something like a Notion Thief or an Opposition Agent, which are much more commonly played, they're not actually going to stop us at that point. So it's definitely kind of a read the room card, but for the price, which bear in mind, you can get off Spellseeker, which makes a big difference in this deck. For the price, it's actually one of the more efficient win cons in the deck.
And then you have a shared summons that is basically the same thing but different.
Yeah, shared summons is sort of like our ad nauseum.
Yeah.
You play the 5 mana at instant speed, and it puts exactly what you need into your hand to win the game.
Yeah, I think more decks should actually play this when I think about it. It's really good.
Yeah, if you're an AB creature combo, 5 mana is not that much anymore. You should probably give it a shot. We have the benefit of, if Animar is on enough counters, it's effectively a free win. We don't have to pay any additional mana afterwards because you get Statue and Ballista and win for no mana. But if you can end step it in a more traditional build, it's still 2 creature counters right there.
And even if you actually don't have Animar in play, you can still just find Dockside and Recruiter, basically.
I think Kinnan is worth mentioning here as one of the more recent additions to the decks. What we've discovered with playing it is that everything you want to be doing with Dockside actually gets better if you have Kinnan in play. It reduces the number of targets Dockside needs to see to combo off, because every treasure is now tapping for 2, and it gives you a built-in outlet for all of that infinite mana you're making, because you basically just activate until you hit Beast Whisperer, and then you win. So he, I think, was one of the stronger additions to the deck recently that I think a lot of people are going to like when they sleeve that up. The Spirit Guides, which are very good Magic cards, and almost every deck that plays the maximum number of them does. Spirit Guides are staples in Animar these days, I would say, and some people are still reticent about that. Part of the value of them is that while just being free mana is one of the best things you can be in the format, they're also synergy with every bit of our creature synergy in the deck. They pitch to survival, they neoform into statue. There are a lot of other good things you can do with a creature that at its floor is free value.
I'd like to say something here that I think all decks should try to include, because cEDH is really fast, and the best way to try to adapt to that speed is to be as fast as yourself. You more or less need to play these, so to say, because you need to be up to the speed that other opponents are presenting, so to say. So I agree.
I think we were basically throwing away mana parity in the past by not including cards like Soul Ring, the Spirit Guides, the Mana Vault, things like that that other decks are capable of doing that will just outpace us if we don't try and keep up.
So one of the things I was criticizing Animar for, and you mentioned that you've talked about some of my criticisms, but is that you need a lot of things in your opening hand, in my opinion, with Animar for it to get going, because Animar doesn't solve any of your problems from the command zone. Like, for example, a Tymna could solve the card draw problem, while Nayela could solve a combo problem. And Animar does solve a form of combo problem, you could say, from the command zone, kinda. He also solves you, like, he gives you a lot of mana. But, like, your opening hand in your version here demands a turn 1, preferably rock, that seems to rock of sorts, and a form of, like, payoff. But then you might need some interaction as well, and, you know, there's a lot of things to get together. So what is your take on that problem? Or do you think it's a problem? Is this an existing problem for Animar as it currently is?
I think that is still a real issue with the deck. And there are some decks in the format where mulliganing becomes very, very easy. Think like Blue Farm, where you just need mana, power out Tymna and Crom, and the deck will figure itself out. Animar is not that kind of deck. You need to have an opening hand with a plan in it, and that plan is going to require mana, it may require protection and things like that. So Animar is very much the kind of deck that requires sort of aggressive, disciplined mulligans to make sure that your opening hand does something. I will say that problem is a lot less of an issue than it was in the past, because you don't have to throw away hands anymore that just have something menial like a Bond Beetle in them. All of a sudden you have a hand that has a Soul Ring in it instead of that Bond Beetle, and that's just a lot more impactful regardless of what you're doing with that hand. So I think by increasing the card quality across the board, and we made probably 15 or 20 swaps that were just bad niche Animar only cards getting replaced by basically format staples. And so by doing that, we've helped that problem as much as can be done in a deck of this nature. And I think it's also worth saying that there are decks that have this same problem, but actually still work pretty well. For example, Najeela is arguably one of those decks, and arguably the best deck in the format by some metrics. She gives you this kind of 4-turn clock to wipe the table with warriors, but she doesn't give you draw, she doesn't give you ramp. So there are different decks that require more or less from their mulligans, and I would say Animar's on the higher side, but we're working towards addressing that problem as much as we can.
One big thing that I make this commander struggles videos just to showcase, like, here are some problems you need to think about when you're building this commander. But I think they also kind of showcase like, here is what the cEDH meta game demands of your deck, kind of, so to say. So I'm not saying that Animar is bad. Animar can win, absolutely, 100%. But there are things you need to consider, so to say.
Yeah, and I would say in general, mulliganing is probably the hardest thing you can do in the format. A lot of the time, games are so quick that the cards you have in your opener may be it for the game. And if you don't pick a good opener, you're just toast and you're not going to get there. I think a lot of people are reticent to go below 7 cards when they really shouldn't be. I think the card pool is strong enough that the best 5 you're going to see is miles and miles better than the averagest 7 you're going to see. So Animar in particular is the kind of deck where you can afford to dig a bit.
Yeah, mulligan is like half the game almost soon, or more.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I play a lot of games that end in the middle of turn cycle 2. And, you just didn't have a chance to establish on board if your whole role at that point was play Animar off your Llanowar Elves. And so that's the whole reason I think that really spawned the Discord to push for a new version of the list.
So let's actually look at that. Like, let's talk about mulligan. So, well, this one, no lands, I guess, mulligan.
Yeah, if you had literally any red producing land, I'd be very tempted to keep this, but you gotta ship it. Turn 1 Cradle is always disappointing.
Well, you have Taiga and Carpet, so you could theoretically get...
You could keep on the Carpet and hope for the turn 2 Ristic here, or you do the turn 1 Taiga into the Sylvan for a Dockside on top, and you hope that they feed it. But either way, if this is a 7, I think you probably keep it for Ristic Study. The only downside is Carpet of Flowers and Gaia's Cradle are probably going to be pretty mediocre here. If this is a 7, I say we ship it back and go for something with gas right in it.
Nice.
Now we're cooking. All right, this is our turn 2 Archaic. We can turn the Archaic into Sphinx if we really want to. I see no reason not to snap keep this.
This is like everything in hand more or less needs. You have mana acceleration, you have the big payoff, and you have a game plan to follow up afterwards. And you have, well, Red Elemental Blast is kind of limited, but it's interaction.
This hand gives you a turn 2 Ristic with Grazilax as well and multiple pieces of interaction. I think that's probably keepable. Grazilax is a pretty interesting card in that it sort of does our deck's best impression of Tymna, and sometimes that second line of text that bounces creatures back can take people by surprise and give us a spare Dockside too, so it's kind of a fun upside you get every now and then.
Yeah, this is kind of keepable, but it's also a little bit risky. Like, you have a Ragavan turn 1, and that could get stopped afterwards.
If it was me, I would probably play the Ragavan off that land, which I would get a Volcanic, and then pitch the Elf to put the Elvish Spirit Guide to put the Arbor Elf into play. And then next turn, we can always Neoform that Arbor Elf into a Dockside and get cooking. You play Animar off of that, or whatever you draw off Ragavan, things start getting interesting at that point.
If someone Neoforms your Arbor Elf, though, because that is a very telegraphed Dockside, and someone count. Well, we have Force of Will, so we're kind of fine though.
Yeah. Also, it's really hard to get around telegraphing the Dockside there.
Yeah.
And so if it's turn 2, I'm tempted to just jam it there because people know Dockside is coming early, and the longer we go without developing meaningfully on board, the more people are just going to outpace us. So if we can rock it up to 5 or 6 mana turn 2 just off that Dockside, it's probably worth doing so.
No lands. Mulligan.
This is just plain slow, basically. You get a turn 1 land pass, whichever land you choose.
If this was your 4th, though, like, you have to mulligan 2 to the bottom, you could probably
If this is my 4, yeah, I keep this on 4. I would say the cutoff point in terms of mulligans, where you can stop looking for an ideal hand and start looking for an okay hand, is about 5. Once you get below 5, you have to start making compromises. But up until that point, I would say just keep shipping until you see something really nice.
I agree.
For example, this is a hand that you get this on a 7, you can definitely do some stuff with it, but it doesn't do anything particularly quickly, and the game plan is about 4 turns away, so I'm not wasting time on this hand.
This is pod dependent, because Gilded Drake is really awesome, but...
If we can count on someone sticking the turn 1 Crom, that's looking nice for us, but realistically, again, from a 7, I would say ship this back, even if it's got the statue, which is a bit tempting.
Yeah, it doesn't really, like, this hand could get stuck, and it doesn't really do much. Like, you're not developing anything from it.
Yeah, and you arguably aren't putting out Animar fast enough for the Fierce to be relevant.
I kind of like this hand, though.
Now, this is looking good. Yeah, we can go Rite of Flame into a Talisman, and then we've got Arbor Elf off that Talisman. Next turn we've got Kinnan. This hand looks all right. There's no real payoff to it. So if this was early in mulligan order, I would probably try and get a little bit better. But if this is down to my 5 or so, I'm thinking this gives us a solid enough starting point that we can top deck or maybe get wheeled into something better later on. It's not totally dead, at least. This is a hand that desperately needs a dockside and doesn't have a way to turn 1 find a dockside. But if that was, for example, not a Boseiju and a fetch land instead, that's a fantastic opener, but unfortunately ship it. There is no acceleration in there. If you're going into a super grindy pod, if I'm playing with Curious Control in the pod, I'm thinking, okay, this game might go a little while longer than average. I can probably turn 2 the Kinnan, but ultimately it's just not very fast and impactful. There we go, turn 1 Mystic Remora.
Yeah, but it's all in on the Mystic Remora. If that Mystic Remora doesn't stick, then and it doesn't draw cards, then you're dead. But you can keep this.
Yeah, no, that's true.
But you can keep
it. I would keep this down to like a 5-card hand.
Yeah.
Because Mystic Remora is a really, really good opener. And what I have found also is that if you're on Animar and you stick the Mystic Remora, people are going to be more inclined to feed it than they are if you're on Brogsai. So we can kind of sneak by on people underestimating the deck if we get put into an awkward spot with mulligans.
This is true. This is very true, actually.
I hate seeing Eternal Witness in openers because it's just such a dead card, and this has no ramp.
I like this one. Or do I? I take that back. Here's actually a good example of like...
You get the turn 1 Animar. You get the turn 1 Animar, which is always nice. Problem is, then you're basically stuck.
Exactly. Like, this is a good example of like, wow, we have great cards and we can accelerate really well, but then what? Like...
Yeah. And so I think that's a trap that a lot of people will fall into. And it's a trap that I fell into in terms of deck building for years and years and years, which was just power out Animar right now, and then everything else works. The problem is that, no, it doesn't. It doesn't work if your hand is then empty and all you're going to do is try and, I don't know, sit on a Baron for a while.
If your commander was Tymna, you would love this opener.
Man, if they print one of those team-up cards with Animar and Tymna, best friends forever... The world.
They would be 5-color. They would be 5-color. That would be so cool.
Yeah, 5-color with a Tymna in the command zone and Animar. That's so tasty. But
that would actually be really good.
Busted. Yeah. It would. But then Tymna with anything is good.
I can see someone keeping this and then just never top decking a land and just hating himself.
It absolutely can happen. You have multiple pieces of interaction to keep you alive until you get that land, but at that point you're playing a miserable game that you don't want to be playing. I would say Rhystic is a good enough card that you should try to keep hands that get it out as soon as possible, and hands that do power out an early Rhystic are very tempting. But if it's a situation like this and you're absolutely blown out if you don't get there, then I would ship it.
If you top deck Soul Ring though.
Yeah, there's a Mana Crypt in the deck, there's a Soul Ring in the deck, there's a Tinderwall in the deck. Like, you're not out of options entirely.
I think this is a great, like, Worldly Tutor is the solution here.
Yeah, you can get, what I would say is you can go 2 ways with this. Either you Worldly Tutor the dockside to the top, Tinderwall, play dockside if you're going to make a ton of treasure off that dockside, or you Tinderwall turn 1, turn 2, play Animar, turn 3 Worldly Tutor for your statue, something like that. That's a much slower game plan, but you have all the pieces for it right there for you. One thing I will say, though, is that Walking Ballista in the opener is often a bit of a trap because it is the best outlet in the deck, but it doesn't do anything until you've basically already won the game at that point. So if that were, for example, another Tutor or that Soul Ring, this hand would be so much better. But I still think if you go down to like a 5, this is tempting.
So those were some good inputs on like how to think when you're mulliganing with this deck.
It's a good idea with almost any deck to periodically revisit what the shell looks like, test it card for card, go through the whole thing, see what else cool things people are doing in the meta, try and copy as much good tech as you can into the list. And so updating Animar in the way we have over the last couple months has really done a lot for the deck and made it a lot better. And I think it addresses some of those struggles you pointed out in your earlier video.
I absolutely agree with that. A lot of decks needs to be updated because they're a little bit more old school than tweaked toward more like an older stylish. But like there are commanders that are a little bit more to the heart, to a greater majority. So all commanders doesn't receive this like big group of people who want to make it stay alive. Speaking of people like trying to make Animar stay alive, if people have questions to you, or people want to talk about Animar in general, is there a Discord they could look into?
Yeah, I would absolutely recommend anyone who's interested in what Animar is doing these days to stop by our Discord. It's linked through the cEDH database.
Or in the description below of the video.
Stop by our Discord. It'll be linked underneath this video. Feel free to ping me or some of the other mods and just ask, hey, what's up with the deck? Is there a cool list I can look for? And we will be very happy to help you out. We're all there because we just love messing around with Animar, and we'll be more than happy to help you get up to speed.
Thank you so much, Craig, for coming here and talking about your favorite commander, I think, right? I guess?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Thanks for having me. I hope folks learn a lot.
That's it for us. Thanks so much for watching. Take care!
Thank you.